Welcome everybody. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're going to wrap up the seventh chapter today. And so thank you. Stay safe. Stay safe. Okay. We're going to wrap up I think we're around 24, something like that, of the seventh chapter. Let's take a look. Happy New Year to you all, by the way. It's nice to see you on this first day of the new year. Actually, I think these verses lend themselves quite well to a New Year's discussion. Okay, we did a deep dive into text 24 last week, if you guys remember. These verses deal with impersonalism in a really comprehensive way for the first time in the Gita. And so we spent the entire class discussing just one verse, if you guys remember, on Christmas Day. So I'm not going to even try and touch it, because if I do, we'll get into it. You know, there's no way to just touch it. I wind up getting into it in a lot of detail. Just in terms of getting the chapter started, the first 6 chapters of the Gita really focus on a concept of self and a concept of duty. So it's you and this world, which are two of the major topics of a philosophy: a concept of self and a concept of the world. A theology adds in a notion about God or the Creator, the origin. And so the 7th chapter is really where we segue into a proper theology in earnest. And Krishna starts out by explaining that everything in the manifest world is connected to him, and that everything in this world in terms of stuff is different than self. So there's a difference between consciousness and matter. But both those things come from Krishna. This, of course, does away with the notion that the world is fundamentally bad, that it's evil, or that's created by the devil. It also does away with the notion that the world was made for us to enjoy and exploit, because the world, however remotely, is connected to Krishna. And he tries to give us some illustrations of that. That Krishna's desire and intelligence and strength and the light of the sun and the moon, the heat of fire, the fragrance of the earth. And so Krishna's really trying to give us a way to, the taste of water, to look at the world not as something inert and meant to be exploited and divorced of divinity, which is oftentimes how people look at the world. They look at the world as a bunch of stuff. The world is, you say, oh, you objectified that person. Or you say, you should use things and not people, right? You should use things, but don't use people. And, oh, hey, don't objectify that person. Well, objectify means to turn them into an object. To turn them into an object means to turn them into stuff. And so the basic unstated premise of critiquing somebody for objectifying another person is that it is okay to exploit and objectify the world of matter. When you say use things and not people, right? Use things and value people. Don't use people and value things. The mere statement of that is a tacit, unstated premise, which is namely that the world in which we live of stuff is fit to be objectified, is fit to be exploited, is fit to be used. These verses from the Gita in the early part of the 7th chapter challenge that plausibility structure. They challenge that unstated premise. It's interesting, but the very language we use to describe mistreating a person is that you're treating them like an object, which means that we think it's just absolutely fine to treat objects however we want. And the Gita challenges that notion by connecting the world to God. Okay. Then Krishna, having explained that everything is connected to him, he does a little shift. And he says everything's connected to him, but he's yet still beyond everything. Because this idea that everything is sacred, which is very much of a pagan idea, it's very different than the dualistic notions you get out of the religions coming out of the Middle East, which are by far the most popular religions in the world to date. This pagan worldview, this idea that the world is sacred, generally ends in pantheism. But Krishna drops, like, if that wasn't challenging enough to our notions of the world, Krishna drops another grenade when he explains that, and he's not merely pantheistic, he's also beyond the world. He's also beyond the world. And that's panentheism. And then Krishna explains, if you really want to understand him and how all this is connected, you require grace. It goes beyond our fundamental structure to be able to understand our maker on our own, because Krishna is fundamentally superior to us. And so how do you span that divide? It's through grace. And then, well, why doesn't everybody pursue that? Well, some people aren't wired for that. And here's the things you can do to wire yourself towards that. And the best of all is if you're really searching for truth. And that knowledge will lead to devotion. Which gets rid of this neo-Hindu idea that knowledge is one path and devotion is a completely distinct path. It shows a common result of both paths. There is some value in seeing the path of karma, jnana, and bhakti as being different. But you really don't see any kind of hard line of distinction in the Gita itself. You find it's permeable, and that karma is meant to be done for Krishna, at which point it becomes bhakti. And knowledge is ultimately about Krishna, at which point it becomes bhakti. And so there's a harmonization that occurs in the Gita between what are normally thought of as disparate schools of thought. And then that leads Krishna into explaining that, if you can't wrap your head around him as the summum bonum, as the singular source of all reality, as the cynosure of devotion, the focal point of devotion, then you end up surrendering to various gods. And it's kind of like a bhakti misdirected phenomena. And then Krishna loops in with that as almost like a lower rung on that ladder. he loops in the idea of an impersonal conception of divinity. And he critiques that in the strongest language possible. He says those people are devoid of intelligence. Abuddha. Okay. All right. So that leads us to where we are now. That leads us to where we are now. I am never manifest to the foolish and unintelligent. For them I am covered by my internal potency, and therefore they do not know that I am unborn and infallible. This verse goes really nicely with the critique of impersonalism that was just leveled by Krsna that we went over in detail last week. So, na aham, I am not. Prakasha sarvasya, I am not manifest to all. Yoga maya samavrita, covered by my power, my yoga power, my power of maya, my yoga here. Yoga maya. Yoga can mean power, because power brings two things together. So I'm covered by my power of maya, of illusion. I'm covered by my power of illusion, so that your average person doesn't really get it, that there's a person who's avyaya, who's inexhaustible, who's aja, who's unborn. Krishna's standing in front of Arjuna. He's saying, I'm covered. You can't understand that I'm unborn and inexhaustible. And you're left with the idea that Krishna, standing in front of Arjuna, is the zenith of divinity. And that to think of him as unmanifested in an ultimate sense means you have no intelligence. And that Krishna, as a person, as a personal source of all reality, is the zenith of divinity. It's the highest manifestation of divinity. This is plainly what the language of the Gita says. This is incredibly frustrating for impersonalists. They spend so much time trying to work their way around these verses, because a straightforward reading of the verses is just catastrophic. It eviscerates and evaporates and disintegrates an impersonal notion of divinity. All right. I'm covered by my power of illusion. Mudha ayam na abhijanati loka. The bewildered world does not know this. What? This bewildered world does not know. Mam ajam avyayam. That I am unborn and I am eternal. So those two verses, the verse that we treated last week and this week, this first verse, they flow together very nicely. And it also repeats this idea that people can't understand God without some grace. That they don't even try, but that even try as they might, they can't get there. It's sort of argued from two angles. One is, here's four types of people who never try to approach me. And then what we're left with here is, that these people can't understand me, they don't know me, therefore they don't approach me, but also that they, by their power, don't have the ability to understand me. And this leads again to the same question of, what can I do to make myself more likely to be able to understand Krishna? This naturally leads to this question. What can I do to make myself more likely to be able to understand Krishna? It's a natural question. And so previously it was like, here's 4 kinds of people who don't get it. Here's 4 kinds of people who do come towards me. But I'm covered. And so, who are these people who can't approach me? And who are these people who can approach me? And in a lot of ways, we're now going over the same information which was introduced 10 verses back. The kinds of people that don't surrender to Krishna and the kinds of people that do. So, let's talk a little bit more about Krishna first. Vedaham samatitani. Aham, I, Veda, I know, samatitani, all those who have passed. It's a fancy way of saying people who have died. I know them. Vartamani, vartamanani, vartamanani, cha Arjuna. I also know those who are currently moving, who are currently living. I know those who have passed, and I know those who are still currently with us and moving through this world. So I know the people who lived in the past, who passed on. I know the people who are currently living. And then what will be the next one? Bhavishyanti Chabhutani Mam. So, and I also know all those beings who will be. Mam tu Veda na kaschana. But nobody knows me. This again highlights this idea that it's fundamentally not possible of your own endeavor to understand your source. Science is largely based on the idea of controlling things and thereby studying them. But what if the thing that you wish to study is fundamentally and permanently beyond your control? How do you study something which is beyond your control? Now, to some extent, God's not beyond our control. It's interesting, but we have an orderly deity. We have a world which is filled with logic and order. We have a world which is filled with logic and order, where the rules of physics work uniformly, where the rules of logic work, where math works, right? Hey, Judy, it's lovely to see you. Madhuri, Geraldine, and Lola, and Gopal, and Leela, it'd be great to see you guys' faces. That's why we're on this thing together. But it's wonderful to have you with us, Judy. Welcome. That, by the way, is always the case. You guys are just like showing up now as if you just figured it out, that we're using this technology precisely so that I can see you. You could just take it for granted that I always wish to see your faces, which is why we're using this nifty new technology. Okay, so science is based on the idea that you can control something and then study it. But Krishna, being by his very definition fundamentally beyond your ability to control, doesn't lend himself well to objective scientific inquiry. Kind of. However, given that Krishna has created a world which is logical and reasonable and which follows certain standards, it would make sense that Krishna was a logical and consistent source. And therefore, by looking at this world and understanding the nature of this world, we can get a sense of divinity. There may be limitations for how much we can understand of the whole package, given our limited natures, and that the thing we're studying is fundamentally beyond everything which exists, yet inclusive of it. So, Krishna, he makes this point more so in this verse than earlier. I made this point earlier in the chapter, but if you look at the verses, Krishna says, I'm beyond the modes, but the modes are very difficult to cross unless you surrender to me. And some people don't, and some people do. But he doesn't make this point that, Krishna is this omnipotent, alpha and omega and beyond entity. And that we fundamentally don't possess the ability to know him. And so in some ways it's redundant, because we already have, on some level, we've already dealt with it. Krishna said all people are within the three modes and I'm beyond the modes. So he set it up with a bit of foreshadowing, like you might get in a piece of literature. But, I'm just going to tangent off for a second. Leela has a degree in film from Boston University, which is an extremely, it's an extremely fancy school. It's like just a tiny little rung below the Ivy League. Anyway, they have some kind of really nice film. Sorry, somebody came in the temple and it disturbed me. I apologize. So she got a film degree, and they have kind of a fancy hey, don't go in the pujari room with karmi clothes on. Hare Krishna. Thank you. Please don't talk during class. Thank you. I know, but you're interrupting class. We have so many people. Please be quiet. Thank you. Sorry. That's my spirit animal of a bear coming out. She went to this fancy university, got a fancy degree in film, and they have this alumni chat group thread that's going on, and people are able to interact, present and past students of the film department. So on April Fool's, they put out a trailer as an April Fool's joke for a movie called The Dresser. And it had a bunch of it made a bunch of homages to Poltergeist and other horror movies. But it was the cheesiest trailer I've ever seen in my life, about a dresser that killed people. And anyway, some people who were producers, who were still on the thread, were like, this really needs work. We think your concept is flawed. We'd be willing to meet with you to discuss it. They didn't get it, that it was an April Fool's joke. Anyway, so she randomly sent it to me like a couple of days ago, and I just thought it was the funniest thing ever, and started showing it to all my family members. So I've watched it like 4 or 5 times at this point. It's hilarious. It's on YouTube. The Dresser. You guys can look it up. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. Anyway, even in that cheesy April Fool's trailer from film students who had obviously too much time on their hands. And hey, Gopal, you always have permission to lay down. Like, you're cool. It irritates me when other people do that, but it like warms my heart when you do. So you just don't ever think you got to sit up. You lay down for all my classes every day. We're happy to have you. Gopal is battling cancer at the moment. You think you got it bad. He's got 2 small kids and he's battling cancer. And so, think about it. Like small kids, like one's not even a year old. And he's young, 42, 43, something like that. He's a kid. So, even in that cheesy trailer, they did foreshadowing. The guy put his heart medication and a fire extinguisher in the dresser, and then the house caught on fire, and he died of a heart attack, and the medication and the fire extinguisher were in the dresser, and they couldn't get it out. But even you needed foreshadowing there. And so Krishna really did some foreshadowing. He explained earlier in the chapter that you need to approach him, and that not everybody does. But he didn't explain it this clearly, how fundamentally beyond everything he is. And so, part of you might be wondering, well, how am I ever going to get around to worshiping Krishna? Because he's covered, right? And therefore, by his own power. And so how am I going to circumvent that? It's an impossibility. You have this deity that's fundamentally beyond the world and only remotely connected to it. But here we are in this world. How will we ever be able to understand Krishna? And like I said, he's going through this theme again. We've already touched it. But now you see Krishna evolving his teaching on this point. All living entities are born into delusion, bewildered by dualities arising from desire and hate. Desire and hate, the word hate, it's important to understand the word hate. The word hate in Sanskrit is used in much the same way that we use the word hate nowadays. It used to be that the word hate was like the worst thing. You hate somebody. It was almost like evil. But now we say, hey, stop being such a hater. Why are you hating on me? Why you hate me so much? And we use the word hate in a much more, colloquially, we use the word hate in a much more loose construct to indicate repulsion or derision, but not a fundamental feeling. And so you're loving me one day, you're hating me the next. I don't take your love so seriously, I don't take your hate so seriously. So icha and dvesha, this Sanskrit compound, which means desire and derision. What it really means is you're attracted to something and you're repulsed by something. You're attracted to something and you're repulsed by something. So, all living entities are born into delusion, bewildered by the dualities arising from desire and hatred. Now, of course, this leaves open the door that what if I transcend desire and hatred? Would I maybe be then in a position to understand Krishna? It's a natural question one could ask. Also, there's a fault, and I don't want to get too detailed on this, but try to follow this. If you're born into delusion, wouldn't that be a fault on God for making you be born into delusion? If you only have one lifetime, it would be. If you being born into delusion was a result of your previous life's rebellion, then it would just be Krishna following your lead from one dance to the next. Did you follow that? So these kind of little troubleshootings are sometimes important to make so that people don't get a misconception of what we're trying to teach. But what we're left with thus far this week, and forgive me because I had the interruption to class and maybe I'm a little foggy from the big party last night, the big New Year's party. That was a joke. In case you're thinking why wasn't I invited? I'm just making a joke. just to recap for myself and also just to make sure that we're all on the same page, Krishna explained the foolishness of impersonalism. He continued with that. And explained that actually he is the acme, the zenith, the alpha, the original conception of divinity. A personal form of divinity in the first person. But he's covered. And then you're left thinking, okay, well, how do we overcome that covering? And then Krishna explains here that fundamentally he is beyond everything, knows everything, is omniscient, and that is unknowable by us, perhaps permanently, because we are not even capable of understanding God. But then he introduces this idea that it's really our desire and our repulsion and our infection with dualities. Literally the verse says, Icha dvesha samutena, by desire and repulsion. Dvandva mohena, by the illusion of the dualities. Sarva bhutani samoham, all beings are bewildered. Sarge yanti, and they're bewildered. They go to a bewildered state from their very birth in this world. So what we have here is that it's our being too caught up in duality that makes it not possible for us to understand Krishna. And it leaves open this idea that, well, what if we got free from that duality? I would argue that fundamentally, as individual spirit souls, we require the influx of grace to really get the full picture. However, I would also argue that fundamentally we have the ability to commune with God, that that's our divine right, that that's our birthright as souls, eternal souls. And so you can argue this point from either angle of vision. You can argue that grace is required and we can't do it on our own, but you can also argue that we fundamentally have the ability to interface with that grace, and therefore really we have the ability to know God. It may involve grace, but if we can affect grace by being receptive to it, then we still have our future in our hands. Does that make sense? So, the next verse. Persons who have acted piously in previous lives and in this life, and whose sinful actions are completely eradicated, they are freed from the dualities of delusion, and they engage themselves in my service with determination. This verse is problematic, and it's also harmonizing. We're going to have to spend a little time on this verse, and you guys are going to have to pay attention, because this is, it's like a low intermediate level. It's like a beginner blue belt level or a high white belt level. And you guys are going to have to pay attention. So please listen very carefully. If acting piously in your life is enough to fully qualify you for bhakti, bhakti no longer becomes a fundamental gift that goes beyond the world. And furthermore, bhakti, love for Krishna, becomes dependent on being pious. It's very important for our tradition to never have bhakti dependent on karma. Because if bhakti was dependent on karma, if love for Krishna was dependent on pious deeds, then we should not teach people to love Krishna. We should teach them to be pious because that's the backbone. You follow? Now, of course, we also don't want to say you can be impious and love Krishna. So we got to tread carefully. And this verse provides our theologians with an opportunity to tread carefully and to really, really lay out our theology. I don't know how much we're going to get into it, but I at least want to give it like a first pass. And then depending on your guys' ability to fathom it and understand it, we'll do more or we'll move on. Right off the bat, this verse resolves the conundrum I've been setting up the whole class. Krishna's covered by this magic illusion that stops you from being able to see what's really going on behind the curtain. Because Krishna is omniscient, but we don't know Krishna because we're covered. Well, are we fundamentally covered? No, you're covered by delusion and dualities. But if you free yourself from duality, then you can actually approach Krishna. And therefore this resolves the whole thing. We need to become free from duality. We need to act piously. We need to have integrity. This is why it's such a great verse for New Year's. You want to do something for New Year's? How about follow your vows? How about that as your New Year's resolution? How about instead of worrying about losing 5 pounds, how about you follow your vows? How about you chant your rounds? How about you live with integrity? How about that? And in case you don't know what I mean by integrity, let me be more specific. Follow your vows and chant your rounds. That's what I mean when I say integrity. Yesham, for those people, all these people, sarva bhutani, all the beings in the world, are born into duality. But yesham, for those people who but for those who antagatam papam, to those whose sins have come to an end. Anta means end. Gata means like a goal. It's like they've reached the end goal. What's reached the end goal? Papam. Their sinful activities. Now, it's important to understand this. Why do we behave piously? Not because of some Victorian idea that Krishna's up there with a lightning bolt and he's going to throw a lightning bolt at you if you do something sinful. If you are too enamored by this world and you find this world to be too sexy so that it draws all your attention and addicts you and intrigues you to such a point that you can't think about anything else, then you won't be able to think about Krishna with a clear head. You're too spun. It's like if you go to an AA meeting drunk, they'll just tell you, go get sober, then come back. Because whatever counseling we give you right now, you're not going to be able to hold it. It's a waste of everybody's time. Let's not cheapen it. Go home, dry out, and come back when you're sober. We want to be able to do something amazing. We want to be able to focus on divinity with laser-like consciousness. We want to really plumb the depths of the universe. We want to mine those gems of reality that are dug deep. And to do so, we got to be focused. And if you're too enamored by this world, you're anything but focused. Our following of our vows is much more surgical. It's not just because they're written in a book somewhere. It's because sex, drugs, meat, gambling, and money too. They spin people. They get people all spun out. They can't think straight. They get seduced. And so you got to live free from these things, just so you got a fighting chance to breathe and see the big picture and be able to do the right thing and focus on Krishna and pierce through the veil of illusion and see through the matrix and see what's really going on. It's like trying to be a pro fighter without being in shape. It's just like it's not going to work. Your lack of athleticism will crush you. Your lack of cardio will mess you up. Fatigue makes cowards of us all. Patton said that. George Patton, General George Patton. So, we need to embrace piety so that we can see through the dualities and dive deep and be able to get through the choppy water, the white water, the shore break, and actually get out to sea where we can dive a little bit. Does that make sense? You follow? Jananam punya karmanam. And for those people who are punya karma, they act piously. And Prabhupada says either in a previous lifetime, because sometimes you meet somebody who's already devoted. They're just kind of born in a very devoted way, and they just, from their earliest memories, they have this basic devotion and this basic piety about them. That would mean it's from another lifetime. Some people have a basic sinfulness about them, and that means they got a lot more work cut out for them. They got a lot more work cut out for them. It's interesting, but the Hare Krishna movement, a lot of times we get like real pious Catholic people, and we get real pious Jewish people. You know? Because people were raised with some kind of basic devotion, some kind of basic piety to them. And then they found what they were always looking for with us. Ultimately, our doors open to anybody. Unless you come in during one of our classes during COVID. And so, yeah, we need to take this seriously. And so this verse harmonizes that. It's like, how do I be out of that one category of people who are averse to Krishna, and how do I get into that category of people who are interested in Krishna? Krishna's spoken about it a couple of times in this chapter. How do I make that move? This verse answers that question. You got to embrace some piety. That's how the verse harmonizes. But here's how the verse problematizes. We say that bhakti is fundamentally different than karma. If we say that bhakti is dependent on karma, then karma becomes primary and bhakti becomes secondary. For instance, if consciousness is entirely dependent on brain function, then there's no possibility of consciousness existing beyond the brain. Therefore, consciousness is an illusion. It's a secondary property of electroneural synapses. You follow? And therefore, there would be no consciousness after death or outside the body. Therefore, you're not an eternal soul, and consciousness is just this grand second-level phenomenon. Much like music is dependent on electricity. No electricity, no music coming out of a recording. Do you follow this? So, we don't want to say that bhakti is fundamentally derivative, because then that means there's nothing special about grace. Bhakti is ultimately just caused by our pious action. Grace is ultimately just caused by our pious action. Krishna is nothing more than a machine, like a vending machine. And when you behave piously, then automatically you get bhakti. Practically speaking, that's not true. There's lots of super pious atheists in the world. There's celibate atheists, and sober atheists, and celibate sober atheists, and atheist do-gooders. They're called human secularists, and moral and atheistic people. You could not say they had bhakti. But if you say bhakti is simply based on pious action and a lack of sinful action, then they would be said to have bhakti. And so there's got to be something else, because that definition of mere piety by itself does not automatically and naturally give rise to bhakti. This is a harmonizer because it puts the responsibility for bhakti on our shoulders. It gets God out of the hot seat. It means we're the architects of our own future, that Krishna is responsive to us, that in that sense he is just like a machine. And if we put in the right data or we put in the right information, then we get the right result. And that shows fairness and justice and logic in the world. And we do want to have a logical deity, a consistent deity, a reasonable deity, a fair deity, because, an all good deity would definitely be fair. And a chaotic deity leads to a dystheistic deity who arbitrarily awards punishments to people where they don't deserve it. Do you follow this? So, this verse, read in a straightforward way, like I did initially, solves a lot of problems, and it makes it really simple. You want to know what it takes to surrender to Krishna? Become pious, have integrity, make that your New Year's resolution. Say la vie, we're good to go. And it solves the problem. But it creates another problem for our tradition. For most people you meet on the street, this would be what you would tell them, and you wouldn't tell them anymore. To understand what I'm getting at, and I'm just going to read from Prabhupada just for a brief moment. Prabhupada says, the example is often given that the Lord is like a wish-fulfilling tree. And whatever one wants from this tree, the Lord supplies. So if you want Krishna, you get Krishna. If you want Maya, you get Maya. You follow? But here the explanation is more complete. That means that for Prabhupada and our theologians, going back thousands of years, to simply say the Lord is like a desire tree who waits and just responds to your desires, that's not the highest understanding. There's a more complete understanding. And he's commenting on a verse in the 9th chapter that I'm not going to go over because it'll take too much time. The Lord is here stated to be partial to the devotee. The Lord is here stated to be partial to the devotee. Actually, the verse says the Lord is equal. Samoham sarvabhutya, I'm equal to all beings. But there's another little interesting wrinkle in the verse where Krishna says, they are in me and I am in them. And Prabhupada, he's exploring that. And he says the idea of seeing God as partial is superior to seeing God as equal. You follow? This is a rough concept for people to wrap their heads around. And I've got like 10 minutes to make it work, so I got my work cut out for me. People don't even think in these terms, and I got to resolve it. And I have like a subversive resolution, so I got my work cut out for me. I'm going to have to make up for my spaced outness earlier in class by really buttoning this up tidily. The Lord is here stated to be partial to the devotee. This is the manifestation of the Lord's special mercy to the devotees. The Lord's reciprocation should not be considered to be under the law of karma. It belongs to the transcendental situation in which the Lord and his devotees function. Devotional service of the Lord is not an activity of this material world. It belongs to the spiritual world, where eternality, bliss, and knowledge predominate. Okay. What Prabhupada is saying here is that bhakti, our spontaneous love for Krishna, leaping from our hearts towards Krishna, falling in love with Krishna, that special, rare something that devotees have, where they're in love with Krishna. They're willing to do anything for Krishna. And I don't mean anything like let's jump off a cliff or something like that, because we have a concept of God being all good. But they're willing to really do anything for Krishna. Go anywhere, do anything. They love Krishna that much. They're completely swept up in an emotional, intense, spiritual relationship of romantic love with the source of all creation. They're dancing to the beat of a different drum. The world makes music for them, but people can't hear it. And Shakespeare said that. Krishna has to also engage with a devotee on that level. Now, Krishna wants to engage with everybody on that level, but a devotee opens the door. In that sense, we are the architects of our own future. But Krishna's in love with us too. A deity who couldn't fall in love with us wouldn't be a deity I'd want to worship. And where did I get my ability to fall in love anyway? Where did I get it from? I must have gotten it from my source. And a deity that wasn't capable of falling in love, of growing, a deity that wasn't capable of growth, maybe Krishna's infinite, but if he wasn't capable of growth, there'd also be some deficiency. And so when we start to talk about how the devotee loves Krishna and how Krishna loves the devotee, it's magical, it's spiritual. It's not something that you get from mere piety. We need that piety so that we can focus. We need that piety so we can pay attention. But the seed of bhakti is not created by that. The seed of bhakti lives in the heart of a devotee. And it's transplanted into our own hearts. And we water it as we engage in spiritual practices. We water it as we follow the regulative principles. We weed the garden as we follow the regulative principles so the right tree grows in the right way. But the seed is not of this world. Not a devotee of himself. Love of Krishna doesn't really belong to Krishna. The ability to love Krishna, the ability to love is Krishna's gift to us. But loving Krishna is the property of the devotee. That's why Krishna finishes the Gita by saying, one who shares this secret with others is doing the greatest work. He tells Arjuna to go out and spread this message. Because it's ultimately the devotee who is the mercy wing of the devotee's army. He's the attaché for Krishna's army. He's the diplomat that goes into the world and makes devotion in others possible by planting that seed, a seed that actually is a piece of their own heart. If we say that bhakti is caused by mere piety, we remove the magic of this spontaneous desire to love Krishna. If we say that bhakti is dependent on karma, we ignore the very thing that makes bhakti special. So what's really being said here is there's certain things you can do which make you more apt to be able to grow that seed of bhakti. Or there's certain things you do after that seed of bhakti is planted that make it more apt to grow in you and not lay dormant. Or there's things you can do prior to that bhakti that will make your heart more fit. But if you say that mere piety causes devotion, then every person who follows the principles, every person who acts piously should automatically become devoted, but we don't find that. And so this is something which our theologians find in this verse, that you don't find the resolution in this verse. You can find the resolution, like I said at the end of the Gita, where Krishna explains how that it's the devotee's job to give bhakti to other people. And he bequeaths that job to the devotee. He also does another place in the Gita where he tells you to find a guru. But that's essential. And of course it's all over the Vedic scriptures. But this verse by itself creates a problem. It doesn't answer it. And so our theologians rush in and they write lengthy purports to try to explain this point. So on one hand, for most people when we're starting out, we explain to them that God is fair, fundamentally fair. And that's like as much as their cup can swallow. Because they're trying to get around the idea of like God being evil and suffering that people don't deserve it. And oh my God, karma and reincarnation, I take responsibility for everything I do. And that's like mind-blowing for them. And that's as deep as their cup will go. So you teach them that, and that's a win. But there's this whole other side to the equation, which is then bhakti becomes dependent on karma. And our theologians are like, no way. And then they spell it out for you. And again, they have to go beyond what you can find in the verse itself. You go beyond. Now, of course, they'll just say, acting piously. Here's what they do. They say when it says act piously, it means acting piously and coming in contact with a devotee. You follow? It doesn't mean acting piously and digging wells and like helping old ladies cross the street and stuff like that. It means acting piously by coming in contact with a devotee. Prabhupada one time said, if you merely say hello to a devotee, your spiritual life has begun. Prabhupada liked us distributing books. He thought if people gave money to our movement, that would bless them and they would be more likely to be able to understand the books they purchased. And so there's this idea, we have to become devotees. We have to behave purely. There's like big stuff going on. If not for yourself, if not because you want to like see Krishna, just for the sake of being able to represent our tradition and the people who walk before you, you have to follow the principles, follow your vows, keep your promises, chant your rounds, do the right thing, and have some integrity. And that should be your New Year's resolution. Every year. And then every day. And then we have to go out and help people in the world and make bhakti possible in people's lives by growing it ourselves in our own hearts and then transplanting those seeds to other people and teaching them how to grow it. So, on one hand, this verse is beautiful because it resolves the problem. Please stop. On one hand, this verse is beautiful because it resolves the problem of what's going on? How do I make that shift from turning away from Krishna to turning towards Krishna? It's very simple. You need to behave piously and follow the rules. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Because if that told the whole story, then every pious materialist, karmi, would automatically become a devotee. So the word punya here, which means piety, must include some spiritual devotional piety. You follow? And we can argue for that. Krishna says he's the ultimate enjoyer of all piety. He's the ultimate enjoyer of all pious acts. So Krishna does identify himself as the ultimate beneficiary of all piety, and so there is some sense in which you're remotely connected to Krishna. But the reality is no one just automatically becomes a devotee. They meet a devotee. And something gets awakened within them. It's not something that gets awakened within them. A seed is planted within them. Or if you want to see it differently, the seed was already within you, but the devotee becomes the catalyst for sprouting that seed. You do either way. It's fine. We prefer to say the devotee plants the bhakti lata bij, the seed of the vine of devotion. It's planted in your heart by the Guru, by the Vaishnava. And from that, a miracle occurs, and there's this je ne sais quoi, this certain something that you can't quite put your finger on, where you have some love for Krishna, some desire for Krishna, some feeling for Krishna. And that feeling is not mere sentimentality, or at least it needn't be mere sentimentality. It's something special, and then your piety grows it, or your piety prepares you that when you come across it, you'll value it more. But although we solve the problem and put everything in your hands, and we make it easy, and God is out of the hot seat for being partial, there's a deficiency, because the nature of love is it's partial. The nature of love is you love somebody fully and completely. And so Krishna may be willing to love the whole world in a full and complete way, and interested in doing so, and falling over himself to do so. But when a devotee opens that door, some magic happens. And so it's resolvable. It's resolvable like this. Ultimately, Krishna is pouring the rain of mercy on the whole world, and we're just sitting under an umbrella, and we're not letting that rain pour on us. But when we remove that, and that's on us, it's our fault, it's not Krishna's fault. When we remove the umbrella, we then allow that rain to touch us. But that rain is magical. It's like intimate love, which by its very definition is personal and unique and meant just for you. And there's a rain shower that's meant just for you. And that affects you and transforms you. And Krishna is reaching out to you in a very personal way, and you reach out to Krishna back in a very personal way, and Krishna cares for you. Now, he's ultimately willing to do that for the whole world, but that doesn't make it any less special because he's omnipotent. So he gets to love you the same way like a boy and a girl fall in love. But he can love everybody like that because that's what it means to be omnipotent. In this way, we walk this razor's edge of appreciating the personal nature of our relationship with Krishna, the intimate nature of our relationship, the partial nature of our relationship, where Krishna really bends over backwards for us, and we experience that. And we have that alongside justice. And this is our attempt at balancing mercy and justice, works and grace. We have a very intricate way we do it. It's very nuanced. But you really find all religions of the world playing with this, with concepts like works versus grace or justice versus mercy. This is what they're trying to deal with. And this is our version of that. We don't have like an eternal hell that we have to justify. We don't have all these like lousy ideas we have to justify. But we do have to explain the nature of devotion. And so the punya here means bhakti punya. That you come in contact with a devotee and you appreciate it. They throw bags of nuts and dried fruits off the Rath Yatra cart. And you grab it and eat it. The devotee asks you what time it is. And you tell him what time it is. He gives you a book and you give a donation. He says hello to you and you say hello back. You appreciate the devotees walking down the street and chanting. You think, oh, those people look very happy. Something like that. You know, when I was a kid, I'll finish with this. When I was a kid, my mother used to take me to watch the devotees do Harinam in Westwood. My father was going to UCLA, and I was born in Westwood. I was born in Santa Monica Hospital off of Wilshire on 15th Street. But I was raised the first 3 years of my life in an apartment on campus off of Levering in Westwood Village while my dad finished up his work for his master's degree in architecture. And when I was 1, 2 years old, my parents would walk me around Westwood on the weekend. That's what you did. You walked around Westwood Village. It was kind of like almost like a big, massive, multi-city block strip mall with all the cool shops there. And the devotees would chant there. They would go out and chant every Saturday night. And my parents would take me to go watch them chant. And I was intrigued. My mom told me I would always make her wait there, and I would cry if they would leave too soon, and I would sit there and watch the devotees chanting, transfixed. And then I was 14. I was at a Pink Floyd concert. And I gave a devotee a donation. I was intoxicated. And a devotee approached us and asked us for a donation. We gave him a donation. And he gave us a sticker with Narasimha on it that I still have. I know the devotee. I met him years later. But I was 14. And then I met my Guru Maharaj when I was 17, and I still hadn't got my act together. And he hit me with a sledgehammer and changed my life. In 3 days, he flew to the U.S., and I traveled with him for a couple of days in Southern California, and he just changed my whole world. My life has never been the same since. What to speak of, Steve and Jayadev, when they taught me about Krishna consciousness and how much of an effect that had on me. And so if I look at my own life, at every step, it wasn't some random piety. Some devotee put themselves in harm's way, and they handed me devotion. Little bits and pieces, little bits of piety, little bits of contact, little bits of attraction, till I was old enough where I could actually appreciate the message. That's how bhakti's delivered. And amazingly, by saying that the devotee, and here's why I mentioned it, because I actually could have just said, I didn't have to include the devotee in the description. I could have just said it's a special gift from Krishna. And it would have created the same conundrum and required the same walking that razor's edge. But by saying the devotee gives bhakti, in addition to being faithful to our scriptures, it also exonerates Krishna. To say that Krishna can't give love of himself is not a fault. Krishna is the object of love. He's a lovable object. You follow? The devotee loves Krishna. So he can teach you how to love Krishna because he loves Krishna. But Krishna is the object of love, so he doesn't know what it's like to love himself, which is, of course, why the miracle of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is so spectacular when Krishna becomes his own devotee. And the tidal wave of love that comes from that. And so the devotee loving Krishna and being the holder of that love for Krishna is logical. But it also exonerates Krishna from the critique of partiality. Ultimately, it's not a critique. We think it's a dusana or a fault because of our low level, but on a higher level, it's actually an ornament because it's available to everybody. And that rain of mercy is there for everybody, and it's still partial and special and unique to everybody. It's reconcilable. But even more so, by placing it in the hands of the devotee, we exonerate Krishna. And so grace is available, but that desire for grace, that hunger for grace, that desire to turn towards Krishna, to become Krishna unmukha, to turn towards divinity, that's my New Year's resolution. That's my goal in life. That's what I'm going to do before I die. I might be rich or poor, I might be famous or infamous, I might die in anonymity. Nobody might remember my name. I might do nothing of value in this world. But if I love Krishna, if I make Krishna smile, if I have some feeling for Krishna, then my life is successful. If I turn towards Krishna. And that radical, subversive idea about the nature of what's valuable in life is the property of the devotee, and it's given as a gift. And if we are limited and we can't give it to everybody, then there's no fault because we're limited. If Krishna was responsible for that gift and did not give it to everybody, some fault may apply to him. We can still escape that by saying we have to open the door, but this doubly fixes it. And it adds another layer of nuance and resolution to it. And if you can hold all the stuff together and hold all these ideas in tension, you've become a Vaishnava who's understood our tradition. And then your gratitude to Krishna becomes synonymous with your gratitude to the devotees who brought Krishna to life for you. And as you get closer to Krishna, your gratitude to them just increases. Your love for them just increases. Not in some sycophantic, cultish kind of way, but like in a very straightforward, reasonable way. That's also sweet and special and unique. All right, I did my best. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Hare Krishna.